When Akiko stepped onto the bridge of bodies, her bloodied hands met the vacant stare of a boy still breathing among the dead. Across the river, soldiers watched in horror, but some things cannot be rescued. Only remembered. The morning of August 6, 1945, unfolded like any other summer day in Hiroshima. Vendors opened their market stalls, schoolchildren laughed on their way to classes, and old women swept dust from their doorsteps, the soft bristles of their brooms whispering against the stones. The air was thick with humidity, carrying the distant scent of the river and the faint crackle of radios announcing news few listened to anymore. The war, though omnipresent, felt remote here. At precisely 8:15 a.m., the world ended. A sudden, impossible flash split the sky, not from the ground, not from the heavens, but from everywhere at once, a white so pure it erased shadows. For a heartbeat, all of Hiroshima was lit up like a lantern held against the sun. Then the blast came. It was not sound but violence itself, ripping through the air. Buildings crumpled inward like paper crushed in an angry fist. Glass exploded into dust. People standing in the streets were flung sideways as if yanked by invisible hands, their clothes and skin igniting even before they hit the ground. In the heart of the city, Akiko Takakura and her friend Asami were inside the Gabi Bank, its thick granite walls momentarily sparing them from instant death. Akiko felt her lungs collapse against her spine, as though the very air was trying to flee her body. Asami was thrown across the room, folding like an accordion against a stone pillar. Then, silence. A terrible, howling silence, more suffocating than any scream. When Akiko opened her eyes, she saw nothing. The sunlight was gone, smothered beneath a rising tower of blackness. The walls around her wept dust. Her first conscious thought was not of pain, but of thirst, an aching, primal thirst so fierce it felt like her blood had been replaced by sand. Dragging herself upright, Akiko stumbled toward a fractured pipe leaking a trickle of water. She and Asami filled air raid helmets, gulping the foul, metallic liquid. No matter how much they drank, the thirst grew deeper, bottomless. The bank, once a fortress of stone, began to grow hotter, as if an invisible sun had been trapped inside its walls. Akiko knew they had to leave. 10 minutes after the blast, they staggered outside, and the true horror revealed itself. The streets were gone. Where familiar buildings had stood, there were now heaps of burning rubble, skeletal trees, and craters vomiting smoke into the crimson sky. A blood-red haze blanketed the city, lit from beneath by thousands of individual fires merging into an inferno. At first, it seemed that the streets were empty. Then Akiko realized the ground itself was littered with human remains. Blackened bodies, their shapes barely human, were scattered across the ruins, twisted, charred, crumbling apart like dead leaves. Some had collapsed mid-stride, frozen forever in their final moments. Others had been reduced to piles of ash so delicate that even the faint breeze of Akiko's passing footsteps sent them swirling into the air. A few bodies still clung to hints of life. One man stood in the middle of the road, hands forever gripping a cart that carried the remains of 2 small children. His skin had been flayed from his body by the blast, leaving behind a figure that seemed sculpted from charcoal. Nearby, Akiko noticed something on the ground, a severed hand, its fingers rigid and blackened, burning like candles as the fat within liquefied and streamed to the tips. A low rumble echoed across the devastated landscape, and the first drops of rain began to fall. It was not water. The black rain descended in thick, greasy droplets, each splattering against skin with a stinging hiss. The sky wept poison, the fallout of vaporized rivers and soil and flesh. Akiko tilted her head back and opened her mouth, desperate to drink, but the rain tasted like rust and ash. She wiped her lips, and where the rain touched, her skin turned black and sticky. Beside her, Asami stumbled and fell, coughing violently, her body already succumbing to the unseen death now clinging to every surface. They were no longer in Hiroshima. They were inside a nightmare, a place where the laws of life and death had been rewritten by fire. Farther away, a boy named Hiroshi Ito clawed his way out from the rubble of his collapsed school. He emerged into a world shrouded in a black mist so dense it erased the sun. Around him, dozens of other children stumbled blindly, their flesh hanging in ribbons, their eyes blistered shut. The river ahead seemed to promise escape. Without thinking, Hiroshi and the others ran toward it, their legs dragging, their feet slapping wetly against the scorched earth. When Hiroshi reached the swimming pool near the riverbank, he collapsed beside a row of dying schoolgirls. Their white shirts were stained with blood, their legs were stripped bare to the bone, their faces turned upwards in silent screams. The air stank of burned hair, melted asphalt, and something else, the raw, nauseating reek of cooked human flesh. Hiroshi cupped his hands, scooping up water from the pool, ignoring the floating scraps of skin and clothing. He drank greedily, unaware that every mouthful was death distilled. Above, the mushroom cloud continued to swell, boiling upward into the heavens like a malign deity reaching to crush the world below. A few miles from the city center, Mrs. Sasaki staggered from the ruins of her home, clutching her infant daughter to her chest. The child, miraculously unhurt, whimpered softly, oblivious to the horror around them. Together, mother and child wandered through streets transformed into rivers of fire and ash. They saw no others, until, from the swirling smoke, a figure emerged. At first, Mrs. Sasaki thought it was a man running barefoot. The strange, rhythmic clicking of his steps sounded almost like dancing. Then she saw, where his feet should have been were two splintered stumps of bone, tapping against the pavement with every agonized stride. He ran past them, disappearing into the smoke, leaving behind only the sound of bone chipping against stone. The child cried out, and Mrs. Sasaki hugged her tighter, whispering meaningless comfort into the choking air. Everywhere they turned, there was only ruin. A soldier, Nishioka, stationed outside the city, watched in disbelief as a scorched train pulled itself along the tracks, its cars ablaze, its passengers little more than blackened corpses staring blindly out shattered windows. When they stopped the train, they found the engineer half melted into the control panel, still twitching, still vomiting bile, driven by some last, terrible instinct to keep moving. The soldiers boarded the train, pushing deeper into Hiroshima, but soon they regretted it. The tracks ahead were choked with the walking dead, survivors so burned, so stripped of humanity, they resembled shambling shadows. The soldiers called them ant-walkers, but in truth, they were not walking toward anything. They were walking because their minds had broken, and their bodies had not yet realized they were already dead. Akiko stumbled onward through the city, her breath rasping in her throat, her vision swimming. The sky above was still raining death. And somewhere, in the collapsing heart of Hiroshima, a silent chorus of burned mouths was still whispering the same desperate word. The streets of Hiroshima had become rivers of ash and blood, a labyrinth of horror where the living stumbled side by side with the dead. The fires that had once licked at the edges of the city now consumed it wholesale, devouring homes, temples, and bodies alike. Above it all, the mushroom cloud loomed, its monstrous shadow stretching across the earth like a hand squeezing out the light. Akiko Takakura moved through this world of silence, each step a battle against the heat rising from the ground. Her skin burned where the black rain had touched it, leaving streaks of sticky grime that clung like oil. She clutched her side where Asami had leaned on her moments before collapsing into the rubble, now gone, swallowed by the smoke. Ahead, she saw movement. For a heartbeat, hope surged within her, survivors, maybe rescuers. But as she drew closer, that hope curdled into dread. The figures moving through the devastation were not like people anymore. They shuffled forward with mechanical jerks, heads bowed, arms dangling like broken marionettes. Their skin, where it still clung to them, was blackened and cracked like old leather, sloughing off in long strips with every step. Some had no faces at all, only wet, glistening masks where their features had been scalded away. Others gurgled softly, murmuring the same broken refrain. Mizu, Mizu. Water, water. Akiko pressed herself against the wreckage of a collapsed trolley as they passed, unwilling to be seen by these ruined souls. Their bodies steamed as if they still burned from within. Some dragged their feet in such a way that the flesh peeled away from the soles, leaving bloody smears behind them. It was not life that moved them forward. It was the final, stubborn flicker of muscle memory, unaware that death had already claimed their minds. The ant walkers. That was what they would be called later by the few who survived. But in this moment, to Akiko, they were something worse, an omen of what she herself might soon become. Behind her, something groaned. She turned and saw a man crawling out of the ruins, his legs a mangled ruin. His jaw hung open as he pulled himself across the street, leaving trails of blood that steamed against the superheated stones. Above them, the sky continued to weep its poisonous tears. Akiko felt the thirst clawing at her again, a madness rising in her throat. She remembered the trickle of water from the ruptured pipe inside the bank and the hideous rain she had drunk afterward. Now, every breath tasted like rust and charcoal. She staggered toward a crumbling fountain in the middle of what had once been a lively plaza. The marble was cracked, scorched black, but a thin pool of filthy water shimmered at its base. Without thinking, she dropped to her knees, plunging her face into the water. It tasted of death, bitter, metallic, fouled by ash, but she drank anyway. She was not alone. A dozen others surrounded the fountain, their bodies pressed against the stone like dying animals. Some slurped the black water greedily, others, too weak to drink, simply collapsed into it, their faces sinking beneath the surface without resistance. A girl no older than 10 knelt beside Akiko. Her eyes were gone, burned away, but she smiled as she scooped handfuls of water to her mouth. Skin peeled from her arms in translucent sheets with every motion, but she didn't seem to feel it. Akiko stumbled away from the fountain, bile rising in her throat. She needed to move, to keep moving, to find somewhere, anywhere, that wasn't filled with the smell of death. She turned a corner and nearly collided with another mass of survivors. At least, they had once been survivors. A line of burned figures shuffled down the middle of the street, their bodies swaying in an eerie, synchronized rhythm. It took Akiko a moment to understand what she was seeing. The line was held together not by choice, but by the strips of flesh and clothing fused together by the heat of the blast. They could not separate even if they tried. One figure fell, and the others dragged it forward, stumbling together in grotesque unity. Mizu, Mizu. The word echoed against the broken walls, a chant of the damned. Akiko turned away, pressing her hands against her ears, but the sound drilled into her skull. Farther down the road, she saw a boy standing atop the ruins of a school, waving his arms and screaming. His cries were shrill and cracked, almost inhuman. As Akiko approached, she realized he was not waving for help. He was trying to shake loose a girl who clung to his back, her skin fused to his own by the heat of the explosion. The boy shrieked and tore at her with blackened hands, but the girl only whimpered, her limbs too melted to let go. Beyond them, the river loomed. Smoke coiled from its surface, and the banks were lined with the bodies of those who had sought refuge in its poisoned waters. Akiko staggered forward, drawn by the faint hope of escape. But when she reached the river's edge, she stopped. The water was not water anymore. It was a soup of flesh and bone, of melted corpses floating belly up, their mouths agape in frozen screams. A group of survivors clung to a half-submerged trolley, their bodies barely above the surface. When the trolley shifted, one by one they slipped into the river, disappearing beneath the filth without a sound. Akiko retched violently, her body convulsing with dry heaves. Behind her, the ant walkers marched onward. One stumbled and fell, its arms shattering like brittle twigs against the ground. Another collapsed against a burned-out car, leaving a trail of bloody handprints down the door. A woman emerged from the ruins of a collapsed house, cradling a bundle to her chest. At first, Akiko thought it was a baby. Then she saw that it was a charred mass of rags and bone. The woman did not seem to notice. She cooed to it, whispering lullabies in a voice so broken it barely rose above the crackle of the fires. The ant walkers passed her by, unseeing. The woman sat down amid the ruins and rocked her dead bundle until her own body slumped forward, motionless. Akiko backed away, her heart hammering. This was not life. This was not death. It was something in between, a liminal space where the rules of the world had been burned away along with its people. A low rumble shook the ground beneath her feet. She turned and saw a figure in the distance, a man with a twisted spine, his arms flailing wildly as he ran toward the river. Behind him, a wall of fire consumed the city, rushing forward like a living thing. The fire did not discriminate. It swallowed the ant walkers. It devoured the woman and her dead bundle. It roared over the ruins and into the river, sending plumes of black steam into the sky. Akiko ran. She ran with her lungs burning, her vision tunneling, her heart pounding against her ribs like a drum of war. The ant walkers behind her made no sound. They simply walked into the fire, their bodies bursting into flames without even a scream. The world of Hiroshima, the world Akiko had known, was gone. And in its place, only this endless, silent procession of the dying remained. Ash drifted from the sky, settling on her hair, her skin, her clothes. It was not the ash of buildings or trees. It was the ash of people. Akiko stumbled into a side street and collapsed against a wall, her body shaking uncontrollably. Above her, the black rain fell thicker now, coating everything in a shining, viscous slime. She raised her head, and through the shimmering haze, she saw the city, or what was left of it. A charred skeleton of what had once been life. And the ant walkers, the last testament to what had been, moving onward into the fire, into the silence, into the end. The deeper Akiko wandered into the ruins, the quieter the world became. It was not the quiet of peace. It was the quiet of the grave. No birds sang. No engines rumbled. No human voices rose in anger or comfort. Only the crackle of distant fires and the occasional low moan from the dying punctuated the heavy stillness. Somewhere behind her, the river frothed with bodies, blackened by soot and swollen by death. Ahead, the city lay broken open like a wounded animal, its bones jutting into the blood-red sky. Akiko stumbled past the carcass of a streetcar, its metal frame twisted by heat into something monstrous. Inside, the remains of passengers sat slumped in their seats, frozen in the act of fleeing, their skin fused to the charred metal. The heat was unbearable. Even without flames licking at her, the very air scalded her lungs. Every breath was a battle, every step a betrayal of her weakening body. She rounded a corner and froze. There, staggering down the street, was a figure, a man. His steps were rhythmic, mechanical, like the ticking of a broken clock. Something was wrong with the sound he made as he moved. It was not the slap of bare feet or the shuffle of shoes. It was a sharp, clicking sound. As the man drew closer, Akiko saw why. He had no feet. His legs ended in white, splintered bone stumps that tapped against the pavement with every step, leaving tiny fractures behind him. His arms swung loosely at his sides, the skin hanging in strips like tattered flags. His face was a mask of burned flesh, the lips drawn back in a permanent, skeletal grimace. Click. Clack. Click. Clack. The sound echoed off the ruins, too regular, too steady. Akiko backed away, pressing herself against the wall of a collapsed shop. The man did not notice her. He did not notice anything. He simply moved forward, carried by momentum, clicking his way down the street and vanishing into the smoke. For a long moment, Akiko remained frozen, afraid to breathe. Then she heard something else, a soft, wet shuffling behind her. Turning slowly, she saw another survivor. At least, what was left of one. It was a woman. The river stretched before Akiko like a living wound, its surface rippling with black rain and the slow, sickly motion of drifting corpses. Fires still raged along the banks, sending thick columns of smoke into the bruised sky. The heat had turned the air into a shimmering curtain that made distances twist and shudder. Shapes moved within the haze, some alive, most not. Akiko pressed her hand against her ribs, feeling the bruised bones shift under her skin. Every step was agony, but standing still was worse. If she stopped, she feared she would simply fall and never rise again. Somewhere nearby, a baby cried, a thin, broken sound quickly swallowed by the crackle of burning wood and the endless murmur of the dying. She needed to cross the river. There was no bridge left intact. The steel structures that once spanned the banks had melted like wax, their twisted girders reaching impotently toward each other across the chasm. But there was another way. Ahead, where the current slowed against a bend in the river, the bodies had piled so thick that they formed a grotesque bridge of flesh. Men, women, children, their arms entwined, their mouths frozen in final screams, floated together in a mass grave made buoyant by death. Akiko hesitated at the water's edge, bile rising in her throat. Could she step onto them? Could she walk across the faces of the dead? Behind her, the fires crept closer, the heat pushing her forward like a cruel hand. Tears blurred her vision as she waded into the shallows. The water was warm, almost oily, sliding over her ankles with a caress that felt horribly intimate. Bits of ash clung to her skin. Something brushed against her calf, a hand, boneless and limp. Swallowing her revulsion, Akiko placed her foot on the nearest corpse. It gave slightly under her weight but held. She stepped again. And again. The bodies shifted and bobbed beneath her, some turning their eyeless faces upward, mouths gaping. Her bare feet slipped on exposed ribs, on slick, burned flesh. At one point, she nearly fell, her arms pinwheeling wildly before she caught herself on a tangle of hair and bone. She dared not look too closely at what she touched. The bridge shuddered under her weight, but she moved forward, driven by something deeper than fear, a primal urge to survive, no matter the cost. Around her, the river groaned, as if mourning its burden. Midway across, she froze. Ahead, something moved, something alive. At first, she thought it was another survivor. Then she saw the truth. It was a boy, no older than 7, fused into the mass of bodies, his skin blistered and blackened, yet still clinging to life. He raised one trembling hand toward her, his mouth working soundlessly. His eyes were gone, melted away, but his face twisted with a desperate, pleading expression. Akiko's heart shattered. She wanted to help him, to pull him free, to carry him with her, but she knew she couldn't. If she tried, they would both be dragged under. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice lost in the crackling roar of the burning city. She stepped around him carefully, her movements slow and deliberate, feeling the bridge quiver beneath her. The boy's hand fell back into the water, and he disappeared, swallowed by the tide of death. When she reached the far shore, Akiko collapsed onto the muddy bank, her body convulsing with dry sobs. Her hands were stained black. Her feet were raw and bleeding. Her soul felt hollowed out, scraped clean of hope. But she was alive. Somehow, impossibly, she was still alive. Around her, other survivors emerged from the smoke, their bodies charred and broken, their faces blank. They moved with the same mechanical urgency she had seen before, the same haunted, staggering crawl toward nowhere. Among them was a young boy, maybe 12 years old, his belly grotesquely swollen and his skin tinted a deep, unnatural purple. As he staggered past her, his mouth opened and he vomited a continuous stream of blue-gray fluid onto the ground. Akiko recoiled, but the boy didn't seem to notice. He stumbled onward, joining the endless procession of the damned. Further up the riverbank, she saw a woman dragging herself forward on bloody stumps where her legs should have been. A line of ant walkers followed her, each one more ruined than the last, their blackened faces turned toward the invisible promise of salvation they would never reach. The fires leapt higher behind them, consuming what little remained of Hiroshima's skyline. The once proud city was now a skeleton, its bones picked clean by flame and fury. Akiko forced herself to stand. She moved with the others, her body no longer obeying commands of reason or will. She was part of the current now, a tiny, broken fragment swept along by the flood of horror. At the next bend in the river, the water grew shallow again, and the bodies piled even higher. They had formed another bridge. And beyond it, on the opposite shore, a group of soldiers waited. Their uniforms were singed and tattered, their faces grim. Some carried stretchers, others simply stood and stared, their eyes wide with shock. One of them, a young man with a bandage around his head, saw Akiko. He stepped forward, reaching out. For a moment, she thought he was a vision, a trick of smoke and exhaustion. But his hands were real. They grasped her arms and pulled her from the edge of collapse. He spoke, but she couldn't hear him. The world was a muted roar, a distant hum beneath the pounding of her heart. Tears streamed down her face, cutting clean lines through the soot. She tried to thank him, but her voice failed. The soldier wrapped a rough blanket around her shoulders and guided her toward the trucks waiting farther up the hill. Behind her, the bridge of bodies shifted and sank, breaking apart as the river carried its burden away. The fires crackled and spat, climbing higher into the night. And somewhere, in the ruins of Hiroshima, the dead whispered among themselves, their voices carried on the poisoned wind. Akiko did not look back. There was nothing left to see. Only ashes. Only silence. Only the terrible certainty that nothing would ever be whole again. The trucks rumbled down the broken roads, their tires grinding over rubble and scattered debris. In the back of one, Akiko sat wrapped in a coarse military blanket, her body swaying with each jolt, her mind adrift somewhere between waking and dream. The soldiers said little. What could they say? They had expected to find a battlefield, ruins, perhaps, but nothing like this. Nothing like the silent city of the dead, the endless lines of blackened figures moving as if through a vision of hell. The survivors were few, and fewer still could speak. The trucks passed through what had once been neighborhoods, parks, temples, all reduced to smoking wastelands. Here and there, lone figures stood atop the ruins, staring into nothing, their clothes burned away, their skin raw and weeping. From time to time, Akiko glimpsed small shrines erected hastily at the sides of roads, a photograph set among charred stones, a child's sandal placed atop a pile of ash, a crude wooden cross rising from the scorched earth. Markers of lives erased in an instant. The convoy halted near what remained of a government building. The soldiers set up triage stations, but there was little they could do. Those who survived the blast now faced another, slower death, the invisible poison that clung to the air, the water, the very soil. Radiation sickness claimed them one by one. Hair fell away in clumps. Teeth loosened and dropped from gums. Bodies wasted away, the skin erupting in ulcers that would never heal. Children with swollen bellies wandered aimlessly, their eyes wide and blank. Mothers sang lullabies to corpses, refusing to let go. Old men bowed endlessly to no one, their minds fractured beyond repair. Akiko watched it all with the numb detachment of someone already half a ghost. At night, she lay awake beneath the open sky, the fires still flickering at the edge of the horizon. The air smelled of ash and charred metal, a stench that clung to her skin no matter how much she scrubbed. In her dreams, the dead came for her, the ant walkers, the burning children, the skinless horse. They whispered her name, their voices carried by the black winds, their charred hands reaching out to pull her back into the darkness. She woke screaming more than once, but no one came to comfort her. Everyone had their own nightmares to survive. Weeks passed. The rescue workers grew sick. The soldiers died. The survivors dwindled. And Hiroshima remained a wound on the face of the world, open, festering, unhealed. Akiko eventually left the camp, walking alone into the skeleton of the city. She visited the place where the bank had stood, now nothing more than scorched stones and twisted rebar. She found the fountain where she had drunk the poisoned water, the basin filled now only with ash. At the riverbank, she stared at the water flowing sluggishly past, its surface still slick with oil and soot. There was no bridge anymore. No bodies floated there now. Only silence. Only ashes that whispered with every gust of wind. Akiko sat down on the cracked stones and listened. Listened to the voices of those who had been burned from existence. Listened to the city that had screamed itself hoarse. The world moved on, but Hiroshima remained. A scar. A memory. A warning. And within that silence, Akiko remained too, one among the countless lost, one among the ashes that would never, ever forget.